Good morning, everyone. I'm James Shore, and this is the Art of Agile Development Book Club. Today, we are talking about incident analysis, looking at the bugs and incidents that occur within your projects to understand how to improve your development system. I'm going to get things started, as usual, with an excerpt from the Art of Agile Development. As a reminder, the second edition is out now in both ebook and print editions. You can get it from Amazon by visiting jamesshore.com/s/buy-AOAD2. And excerpts and bonus material are available at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2. Incident analysis. We learn from failure. Despite your best efforts, your software will sometimes fail to work as it should. Some failures will be minor, such as a typo on a web page. Others will be more significant, such as code that corrupts customer data or an outage that prevents customer access. Some failures are called bugs or defects. Others are called incidents. The distinction isn't particularly important. Either way, once the dust is settled and things are running smoothly again, you need to figure out what happened and how you can improve. This is incident analysis. The nature of failure. It's tempting to think of failure as a simple sequence of cause and effect. A did this, which led to B, which led to C, but that's not what really happens. In reality, failure is a consequence of the entire development system in which work is performed. Your development system is every aspect of how you build software, from tools to organizational structure. It's in contrast to your software system, which is the thing you're building. Each failure, no matter how minor, is a clue about the nature and weaknesses of that development system. Failure is the result of many interacting events. Small problems are constantly occurring, but the system has norms that keep them inside a safe boundary. A programmer makes an off-by-one error, but their pairing partner suggests a test to catch it. An on-site customer explains a story poorly, but notices the misunderstanding during customer review. A team member accidentally erases a file, but continuous integration rejects the commit. When failure occurs, it's not because of a single cause, but because multiple things go wrong at once. A programmer makes an off-by-one error, and their pairing partner was up late with a newborn and doesn't notice, and the team is experimenting with less frequent pair swaps, and the canary server alerts were accidentally disabled. Failure happens not because of problems, but because the development system, people, processes, and business environment allows problems to combine. Furthermore, systems exhibit a drift towards failure. Ironically, for teams with a track record of containing failures, the threat isn't mistakes, but successes. Over time, as no failures occur, the team's norms change. For example, they might make pairing optional so people have more choice in their work styles. Their safe boundaries shrink. Eventually, the failure conditions, which existed all along, combine in just the right way to exceed these smaller boundaries, and a failure occurs. It's hard to see the drift towards failure. Each change is small and is an improvement in some other dimensions, such as speed, cost, convenience, or customer satisfaction. To prevent drift, you have to stay vigilant. Past success doesn't guarantee future success. You might expect large failures to be the result of large mistakes, but that isn't how failure works. There's no single cause and no proportionality. Large failures are the result of the same systemic issues as small failures. That's good news because it means small failures are a dress rehearsal for large failures. You can learn just as much from them as you do from big ones. Therefore, treat every failure as an opportunity to learn and improve. A typo is still a failure. A problem detected before release is still a failure. No matter how big or small, if your team thinks something is done and it later needs correction, it's worthy of analysis. But it goes even deeper. Failures are a consequence of your development system, as I said, but so are successes. You can analyze them, too. So normally what I do is I have a series of discussion prompts and we sort of go through them. But in this case, I think what might be more interesting is to just choose some stories of bugs and incidents that you've experienced, sort of talk through them as a group, and people can share their thoughts and opinions. And we had some really good comments in the Discord, so I hope that some of the folks who shared those comments will be comfortable raising them. I see Sarah Ventrice is on the line, and she had a great story in the Discord. Jay Bazuzzi had a good a good story as well. So I hope either one of you or both of you will be comfortable sharing what your thoughts are. I'm going to start out with a story of a company I worked with fairly recently. Um, and this story is not really about a specific bug or incident, but a pattern of bugs and incidents that they had. Really more bugs. What they had was something that I see quite commonly these days. And I think I might have shared this story before in previous sessions of the book club. But what they were seeing was that every team had a product owner, and that product owner was turning into the team's tester to the point that they were starting to hire QA folks, even though this was a classic XP shop and had been an XP shop for over a decade, and was expected to do their own testing. They and we're taking the attitude that we don't need a dedicated QA people on the team because it's everybody's responsibility on the team to make sure that the software was high quality. They were starting to drift away from that because the POs were getting really burned out by testing the team's code. So the company had asked me to look into this. What's going on? Why is it that we're seeing such difficulty getting stuff out the door? Why are we having such quality issues? And what had happened was that the team had really stopped paying attention to test-driven development. And they had also stopped taking responsibility for the quality of their code. And that's why they were sort of turning stuff over to the product owners. The product owners were checking to see if it worked the way they thought it should. And that sort of check is a good check, of course. We want to know that we've delivered what our customers are expecting. But what was happening was it wasn't so much, did we deliver what we expected, but does this work at all? And that was really burning the product owners out. In particular, what was happening was, so I dug into this. And of course, I saw that people were not doing test-driven development as much as they were before. But the question was why? Why aren't they doing test-driven development? And as I looked into it further, what I found was that these teams all had for the most part, a single shared development test environment where all the testing that they needed to do was happening. And when they wanted to test that something worked, it wasn't necessarily that their code didn't work. It's that there was dozens of teams in this organization all feeding into the same shared development test environment. And they would make a change, see that it worked, and then some other team would make a change that broke that. Or they would change the data that caused things to break. And they didn't know how to write their tests so that their test could work in isolation. So their test would operate against this shared development environment as well, and they would blow up. And then the POs would get in there and they would test something and it wouldn't work because somebody else was broken. And it was just incredibly frustrating for everybody involved. So in my mind, the way to solve this was with isolated tests, automated tests that could run on the local development machine without having to worry as much about that shared development environment. And so I asked, what's happening? What's preventing this isolated development environment from occurring? And it came back to, well, we don't have time to do that. And it's much more complicated than the summary I'm giving you. But it basically boiled down to, we don't have time to do that. I said, well, why don't you have time to do that? So we're constantly underdone to deliver more quicker. But when I looked at how long it took them to deliver something, they were spending a good 75% of their time just debugging in this shared environment. And it turned out that there was this sort of complicated feedback loop of it took a long time to get any feedback on whether or not a change was successful because they didn't have the automated tests and they didn't have a development environment, a test environment that they could test manually that was effective. It also took about a minute for their build to complete. So there was just a really long feedback loop. So they bundled up their changes into big changes. And I observed a team working for about 45 minutes before they checked anything. And then when they checked it, it didn't work because something else was wrong. So really big changes, really long feedback loops, which made it very hard for them to change their code. This resulted in buggy software, which resulted in POs finding a lot of defects, which resulted in the POs not testing or not trusting that the development team knew how to do their job. So when the development team told the POs, we need to spend time on improving our development environment, The POs said, no, we need to go faster. And so they wouldn't give the team members permission to improve their development system. This was exasperated. Exasperated? No, that's not the right word. This was made worse by the fact that in this organization, the POs and the developers weren't peers. They didn't have an equal say in what needed to be done. The POs were in charge of the developers, and because they had lost trust, they were never giving developers a chance, permission to do the fixing they needed. Partly because I told you it was complicated, and I'm just going to keep on telling this story until people raise their hand. Partly because in the past, the developers had said, well, we need to do this thing. We're going to do we've got this technical debt. We need to do a big rewrite. And they would spend months doing a rewrite, and then the POs didn't see any benefit from it. They didn't see any increase in performance. So the trust was just non-existent. So because the POs had control over the time, how time was spent, and because the team members didn't know how to incrementally make improvements, they never got permission to improve. So their feedback cycles got longer, their bugs got worse, the amount of bugs that POs had to deal with got worse, the trust went down, and there was this sort of ongoing feedback loop. I'd like to say, and I see that you have your hand up, Sarah, and I'm looking forward to your comment, that just to wrap this story up, I wish there was a happy ending to this. I analyzed the situation. I talked to the company. I said, well, you've got this feedback loop, this sort of vicious cycle where things are getting worse and worse and worse due to POs not giving permission to improve, people not knowing how to improve, and then things getting worse from there. And I said, the key to breaking this feedback loop is just speed up your feedback cycles. If you can just get faster feedback through automated builds, better, faster automated builds, and some initial testing, you're going to see that vicious cycle turned into a virtuous cycle. And I said, but it's going to take some time to figure this out, to make that happen. A couple of months. A couple of months is nothing in the grand scheme of how much time these teams were wasting. So I brought this to their head of engineering, their VP of engineering, and their VP of product, who work closely together. And I said, "This is what's going on." They said, "Yeah, we see it. We agree with we agree with the problem. The people who advise us, do you agree with the problem? Yes, we agree with the problem. We agree with the solution. And we really just got to ship software faster. So what we're going to do is we're going to give a bonus for shipping faster. And sorry, maybe we'll look at this next year." So, not a happy ending, I'm afraid. Well, maybe it will be next year, but I think things are going to keep getting worse because I've never seen a cache for features approach work well. Never does turn out well. So on that happy note, I'd love to hear Sarah's story. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Yeah, so the situation you just described could have been the exact situation maybe 5 years ago. Pretty much exactly the same. It was I actually had to put together a lot to kind of get the buy-in to do some of those things. I had to really start to measure some of the dips, say, okay, the time that we're going to spend is, might be this to do this, but here's the ROI. Here's how much time is being lost in each, because of this one thing, which meant literally measuring at, like as you're working at your desk, how long is it taking before you can run a test? How long before you're able to do this? The fact that you're batching things like you described, as opposed to working in small increments. But I was actually able to make some degree of progress, and there wasn't a feature bonus. So I did end up getting buy-in, and some huge improvements were made by focusing on just those things. Like the local development aspect of it was huge, and starts to get you to be able to work in smaller batches. But because there were so many teams, it was very hard to get. We had to really slow down continuous integration. So it was like, instead of trying to go for like a trunk-based approach, we had to say, okay, we need to not have everybody, if you can't figure out the root cause because everybody's landing in the same place. And so and that's adding to the process. We need to think of ways to start to peel that back. And it was so heavy, but it was a necessary a necessary thing to start to like unwind the so many of those other problems. And anyway, it was pretty much the exact scenario that you're describing there.
Yeah, I like that. I like that story because I think it is kind of a universal experience. I see
Yeah.
this lack of trust between dev and prod, and then I see that turning into this terrible cycle where, especially where prod thinks they're in charge of development rather than a partner in development. And it's interesting that you mentioned CI as a source of problems because this organization was, I think they'd read Accelerate, which is a very influential book. And it's not a bad book, but I think they had put a lot of emphasis on we're going to have frequent integration. And so they were releasing twice a week, but they did not have the underlying capability to do that well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you see things get better after? So it sounds like you introduced some ideas to increase feedback, development feedback, and slow down integration. What happened next?
So there were huge improvements, but there were huge improvements, but there were still like like you could still looking at it and like this whole part of the process is such a waste, but a necessary thing because we still haven't done enough to facilitate frequent commits and on true continuous integration. So it took investing in, because there were multiple teams like you described, investing in supporting environments that they would be able to test in, which is obviously the opposite of like a trunk-based approach, but trying to keep those short and then almost like zipper merging, like when you're driving, but like allowing there to be some degree of assurance as we're bringing things up. And it took having each team commit to have a person from their team be a resource that would be responsible for if something does go wrong when we do start to accelerate the pace that we are all bringing things into trunk, to be the resource that represents the team to help troubleshoot and determine like which of the many different things that went into the trunk line from these various teams might have introduced that. So it was, it took a lot, and it was it was sometimes a little bit of a dance of like introducing something just to get us to the next step that we ultimately are going to pull back on. So, the need to have teams have their own environments is obviously a thing we want to pull away from, so that we're encouraging the use of encouraging towards trunk-based development. But if you can't all land together in a way that doesn't spend all of your time just trying to figure out what's going on, then there has to be, an alternative in the interim. So.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me as you're saying this is that it's really easy to fall into a scenario where things are really hard and everything takes a long time. And then once you get into that situation, it can take a long time to dig your way out. But if you're starting at when you start, if you keep the quality high from the beginning, it's pretty cheap to keep that. Like once you're in a good place, keeping in that good place is easy as long as the culture is there to keep it. But as soon as that culture disappears for whatever reason, people leave, or you get that lack of trust for some reason, or there's we just got to push features, and things nose bomb. They just keep getting worse, and it's so hard to get out of that pit, and it takes such a long time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your comments, Sarah. I know you had some more stories that you posted in the Discord, so I hope to hear more from you. In the meantime, I'd like to go ahead and invite Alistair to come on up. Alistair, welcome.
I saw someone had posted in the chat group about safeguarding, which is that's a good resource. So if you're interested in how to do safeguarding or how to do some incident management, there's some stuff there. This was more just a story of where I work, we had a very ad hoc incident process maybe like 5 years ago. And then people did some very small, small process tweaks that really have rapidly improved it. And what I'm talking about is, like in our case, there's a particular Slack channel and there's like little notes across the top. There's a document that says, here's how an incident works. We have a notion of people who are the incident commander, and they're always kind of on call. We make it really safe to call incidents. Like no one, it's like kind of a no blame postmortem. It's a no blame kind of situation for the incident. Very lightweight Google Doc that has dates and people follow up, and it's just really being like super useful to have this very lightweight, but still a little bit of process. I guess that's really what I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And what that reminds me of is the idea from the lean or Toyota production system of the and-on cord. You see something wrong, you pull the and-on cord, it stops.
Yeah.
Actually, in lean, it doesn't stop the line. It alerts that there's an issue, and you have a certain amount of time to address that issue before the line is stopped. Mm-hmm. You're saying that if you notice something that's wrong, you can call an incident, and there's no negative penalty for that, and it's something that can then be addressed.
No, and people are very reluctant to initially.
Mm-hmm.
I have to kind of goad them into calling incidents even, sometimes. But,
yeah.
And then they see that, it's a very lightweight process if it's not an incident. It doesn't really take up time, and nobody's going to be worried. Like we want to encourage people to we want people to err on the side of calling incidents in some sense, right?
Right. So what's an example of a small incident do you have a story of when somebody called an incident that ended up being nothing, but it could have been worse if it hadn't been called?
Yeah, well, we have a whole lot of new global support people, and so our application is like delivered over the web, and so for example, one of our new people, and of course we want to support them because they're new and they're trying to learn all the complexity of our application so they can support customers. They said, the mobile interface is broken, and the customer reported the mobile interface as being broken. Essentially, there's just a different set of URLs that take you to the web resources that present well on a mobile device as opposed to the desktop, right? So so we're going, no one else is reporting it as broken, so that seems unusual. We have various monitoring tools that will tell us whether or not things are blowing up in production, and none of them are going off. None of the sort of automated alarm systems are going off. But, we go, sure, I think you should call an incident because it could be important because it's going to require a lot of different people, because we've also been doing some changes to our infrastructure with, how we're, anyway, the SRE team is doing a whole lot of changes right now in our sort of Amazon infrastructure. So we thought maybe it could be something like that. They're changing the way, the public web addresses are being resolved to our application. So that could be something like that. So it's worthwhile because we might need to call in quite a diverse set of people to solve the problem. But it turned out they were just typing in the wrong URL, right? They were going, we type in this URL and it doesn't go anywhere. Well, it's because it's actually the wrong address, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, how did you discover that?
Well, we had to actually get on a kind of shared call and basically walk us through how you're diagnosing that the interface is not available. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it really was a very simple instruction where someone said, well, what you do is you basically just add mobile to the end of the address. Mm-hmm. That's actually a imprecise kind of instruction, because that's actually the right way to get to the mobile interface when you're at the root, but it doesn't apply when you're already somewhere else. But this person interpreted it as saying, if I want to go somewhere and see the same thing in mobile, I just add mobile to the end of the address. So they typed it directly into the address bar, and then they hit, the browser just said, I don't know where you're asking me to go.
Right. So you did
interpret that as everything is broken, and so did our customer.
Yeah. So it sounds like I would say this was a real issue, but it was an issue of documentation or understanding.
Yeah.
Rather than the software being down. But of course, documentation supports part of your overall system.
For sure. So again, even though there was no sort of from my sort of developer engineering thing, I would say, okay, nothing was broken. But you're right that the support, my support colleague wasn't able to really kind of answer the question on behalf of the customer's, inquiry, right?
Yeah.
So our support system was broken in terms, it gets back to what you were saying in introduction about really like it's the whole system incidents, right? Not just the software.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks very much, Alistair. I appreciate the story. We had a question in the chat. Is there a template to guide root cause analysis lessons learned sessions that you've used that aligns with Art of Agile development? And I don't have a template, but I do have a process in there. It's in the incident analysis session that talks about creating a history and then using that as a source of discovery. So if you look at the incident analysis practice, you'll find that there. And one of the major features of that is a timeline that you create right at the beginning. And in the Discord, people were commenting on that had been particularly useful for them. So you might want to check that out. Scott has a comment or a story to share. Scott, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I'm part of a large organization. I don't belong to any teams. I'm actually a coach, work with multiple VPs inside of a company. And for a while, I've been working with a VP who has roughly 25 teams working on a single application to platforms. And there have been some rumblings lately that their defect rate in production has been higher than where they've been historically. And this is an application that's only 2 or 3 years old. So he had a couple individuals that I work pretty close with actually dig into the data, and preliminarily it looks like he's right. Like they're on a path so far this year of having a defect rate in production that's about 2 times what it has been in the past. And so I've just kind of been asking some questions, and basically told those 2 individuals, hey, I've been asked to kind of help you guys figure out next steps once you're satisfied with the data. And it's interesting. They were originally going to how can we, like they felt the main issue here was how can we fix the problems in production and get them pushed back into production as quickly as possible. And that was like the end. And I guess I was surprised that I had to remind them. It's like, okay, wait, guys, like we don't want defects to get into production. That's the real problem here, not just fixing them quickly.
Right.
And kind of the light bulbs went on. It's like, oh yeah, maybe that's where we should be focusing. I'm like, it's fine for the first step to be fix them really fast if that's not happening today. But the end game here is let's make sure that we figure out a way to find out why they're happening in the first place to make sure we're not reproducing them in production. So I just thought it was interesting that wasn't the kind of the first place they went.
It is interesting, and what I find particularly interesting is that that's not an uncommon story. The folks that you're dealing with are not unique in that way. It's really common for people to focus just on symptoms. For example, the company I was talking about, we need to get features out faster, and what does that mean? That means people typing on the keyboard.
Yes.
Yeah, we're wasting 75% of our development time every hour. With slow feedback and hunting down defects, but we don't have time to fix that.
Yeah, and I'm sure if I asked, so this is a group that's new to TDD, so not all the teams are doing it. And when I ask questions like, hey, do you guys actually take any time to make sure that you write a test when you find a bug to make sure it doesn't reproduce itself? Well, we can't. Like, look at how big our backlog is. We're always getting. I'm like, you can't do more when you're actually introducing more bugs. That right? In the end, you end up doing less. So at times, you just have to pause because in the end, that's what enables you to do more.
There's the saying from Dune, fear is the mind killer. I think this feature factory focus is the mind killer for a lot of teams. Mm-hmm. It's all about deliver features faster. Just recently, we had the blind spot discovery conversation with Janet Gregory and Abby Bangser. Mm-hmm. And Janet made the point that people may be focusing on delivering features, but they don't even know if they're the right features. Yeah. And then there's the phenomenon you're talking about as well of, we want to really focus on delivering features faster, but we're slower than we could be, and we're delivering more defects because we can't take the time to think holistically. I got to ask, did you ever find out why the defect rate had shot up to twice what it was previously?
They're not at the point yet where they're ready to actually publish the data, so we're not quite far enough along.
Mm-hmm. That the number you shared was really telling to me. You said that this was a startup that was 2 to 3 years old, I think, or maybe a code base that was 2 to 3 years old.
A company that's big, but from what I know, the application itself, the framework they're using is not very mature.
Yeah. So 2 to 3 years, in my experience, is about when you start seeing the impacts of poor technical practices.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So thanks for the story. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome Sarah back up. Sarah, welcome.
Yeah, we were talking about the root cause analysis, and part of that is asking, like what indicators didn't we have that, and the number of times that I've had these conversations and we did have the indicators, and the answer is we just ignored them. Oh, well, we have that, but that's always broken. So in development, so we just assumed that was the reason. And, as opposed to, oh, well, we shouldn't have something that's always broken, in development. Or, the same thing that can cause a bug to show up in development, that you did catch is typically the same root cause in your process that causes the ones to show up that you didn't catch, and that ultimately then make it, into production. So I really try to make sure that we have conversations about like listening and really valuing listening to the signals that we do have, because I found just as often as needing better signals, that the problems that we really have are a matter of listening to the signals that we have already.
Yeah. One of my sort of guiding principles, which I don't know if I've ever written down or said out loud before, but one of my guiding principles is run clean. I want to turn on all warnings, and I want to have no warnings, and I want to have really good logs and no alerts. If I'm getting an alert, then I need to either fix it or turn it off, so that whenever something happens in my system, it's something I take seriously. Because when you've got a lot of noise, it's really easy for something to blip through that's important, but you ignore because there's just so much other stuff, so many other warnings, so many other alerts coming through that you don't see it.
Yeah.
And that sounds like what you're talking about.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. There's so many errors that, that we're not monitoring for errors because, oh, well, those ones we already know about, and not being able to separate that signal from that noise, or just, seeing a bug come through and just fixing it right away, but not saying, how did we get, what were our gaps that got that there in the first place, so that the next time we do that again, and don't happen to catch it, it can persist further. So,
yeah. I got to say, Sarah, you mentioned having a Miro template for the incident analysis process that's in the Art of Agile Development. There was a lot of excitement about that in the chat. You said you might put that up on the Discord?
Yeah, I've honestly never made a Miro template public, so I've got to go figure out what it takes to do that, and then yeah, sure, I'd love to.
Yeah. So for those of you watching the recording in the future, the Discord is at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. And if Sarah does make this available, I'll try to include it in the show notes and a link to it when it comes out. Thanks very much, Sarah. And I'd like to invite Jay Bazuzzi to share his thoughts. Jay, welcome.
Hey, thank you. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this process of incident analysis and doing the remediations that comes from the analysis is you kind of mentioned this earlier. Every incident points to a hazard. And just at this moment, that's when we tripped over the hazard, but the hazard was already. And it doesn't matter too much how severe the incident is. That's just this particular expression of the hazard. Mm-hmm. And that means that every time you can of incident analysis, that's an opportunity to remove another hazard. It doesn't really matter so much which incidents you're responding to. What matters more is how often you're able to turn that crank of analysis and remediate. And so this means it's valuable to scale the incident analysis process down. How quickly can you do it? So something we're used to is if there's a major outage, we should get a lot together and spend a whole lot of hours deeply writing artifacts, various documents. And maybe that's the right thing to do for a major incident, but I also find a lot of value in doing it in the small. The process that I usually use is a 22-minute process, but sometimes I might just do a few minutes. I made a little mistake while coding. Let me stop and think for a minute. Why did I make that mistake? What can I do to make that a little less likely? Maybe it's just extract a method or rename a variable, and that's enough, and then move on. So I think there's value in doing it at all of these scales, from a few minutes up to the person hours.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's actually one of my regrets about the incident analysis technique I put in the book, because it's actually fairly heavy in the way it's described. And part of that is because when you're writing a book, you need to be pretty explicit because people are learning and then they go from there. In the first edition of the book, I had root cause analysis, which is a lighter weight technique. However, I took it out because that's not really how. There's never a root cause. It's root causes analysis. And I wanted to put something a little more sophisticated, a little more in line with what the literature was saying about, how failures occur and what good practice looks like. But in doing that, even though I do mention in the book, you can do this, sort of in the privacy of your own thoughts, I kind of took out that idea of this is something you can and I personally do for everything that happens. Whenever something happens, I think, what could I do to make this less likely in the future? And sometimes I'm like, this was just a goof, and I'll worry about if I see this sort of goof happen again. I usually don't worry too much about a cause if it only happens once. It's when I see it over and over that I am concerned. So yeah, I guess I'm just agreeing with you that I think this is a great way to live your life of just sort of constantly being aware of what's going on and why is it going on and what can I do differently to make that different. Thanks very much for your comments, Jay. I'd also like to invite you, if you want to come back later on, to also share the story that you shared in the Discord. We've got some interesting comments in the chat. Let me see. I've sort of seen them going by, but I haven't been reading them carefully. Nisha says, what's been your experience using Kanban, Scrum, and so forth for support teams? Is there a preference of one way of working over the other? And I did see somebody comment on that. Pete Graves says, support teams, in my experience, can benefit from Kanban to work incidents. If the support team is doing code fixes also, then Scrum might add rigor needed. In general, more mature teams like Kanban, while less mature teams need the overhead of Scrum. I think I find that conversation really interesting because Kanban, if you look back at the software development implementation of Kanban which was popularized by David Anderson, and he did a lot of work back in 2005 or so to try to get people to buy into this idea of Kanban and continuous flow. Even though it wasn't a new idea, Ward Cunningham's, I think, episodes pattern language was a continuous flow Agile method, one of the earliest before Agile was even named. But continuous flow had fallen off the radar. People were really into XP and Scrum at that time. David Anderson did a lot to bring continuous flow back into the mainstream and took a lot of flack for it. Anyway, his first experience where he developed this Kanban approach was a team that was really doing a lot of maintenance and support, sort of responding to incidents type of situation. And it's my opinion that Kanban works really well for that sort of ongoing flow of unpredictable stuff coming in. I generally advise an iteration-based approach for people new to Agile because there's so much value in having the iteration time box and learning from it. But for teams that don't have any sort of predictability in their work, I think Kanban is also a good place to start. And so, yeah, I would agree with the suggestion that it works well with support teams. David has a comment. David, welcome.
Thanks, James. And firstly, that point about the size of the defect, I never actually realized that. And that was a huge insight that the defect doesn't correlate with the size of the hazard. So thank you very much for that in the discussion. And you reminded me of something my friend Nancy von Schoenewald was introduced me to first, called Poka-yoke, which is this Japanese mistake prevention thing where we either try to prevent the mistakes entirely or make it immediately obvious once they occur. The thing that I've found when trying to do Poka-yoke, whether at the code and technology level or at the product level, is that if we do a thing that makes mistakes more visible, sometimes culturally that thing gets kicked out very quickly. I'm just fascinated to throw a question to the group of ways you might have found of reframing it. The idea of reframing experiments as bets is one in the product space. That's like, oh, experiments don't, like if the bet doesn't come off, that's not as bad as an experiment failing, and there's some, but yeah, I'm fascinated if anyone has patterns for making it more desirable to have a Poka-yoke around rather than kicking the poor thing out the building.
Oh, that's a great point. And I think it's actually one of the reasons you see Scrum, sort of dark Agile, cargo called Agile, flaccid Scrum, as Martin Fowler calls it. Because, of course, Scrum is a way of providing insight into your development process, showing you what's not working. Kanban, in its actual method-based form, is also a way of showing you what's going on in your process and what's not working. And I think these things tend to fail because people's reaction to this sort of critique is to get defensive and to do exactly what you're talking about, David, and to blame the process, shoot the messenger rather than saying, hey, this is an opportunity to improve. I'm hoping that people will share their ideas about how to solve this problem. I don't know how to solve this problem, and I've been consulting with companies on Agile for 22 years now. So yeah, if there's a silver bullet or even a reasonably good idea, I'd love to hear it. Because I see exactly the same thing you're talking about, David. I do see some comments that have come through in the chat. Your comments have very much resonated, I think. Sarah says, it's important to make culture where everyone values that retrospective thinking is part of thinking constantly. When I find I introduce something locally, I'm evaluating whether I went off the rails in my approach to TDD or something like that. And Pete says, you're talking about growing a mindset of continuous learning or improvement. How do you approach this, Pete or David?
I definitely don't have the answers to my own question, but you reminded me of one of the questions one of the statements from someone I knew a while ago. He said that Scrum is like your mother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
You invite it into your house, it's going to point out your faults, but ultimately that's a good thing because it leads to a happy marriage. You know, if you resolve those faults, you actually get an understanding of things that are going to make things better. But you just reminded me of the mother-in-law, and yes, we know the pattern. I'm just fascinated by, I don't know, maybe an easy hack out there for getting around getting.
Yeah, I think we're up against a fundamental factor of human nature here. We're almost out of time, but Dan has a comment. Dan, I'm hoping you got a silver bullet for us, but I'm not expecting it. I'd love for you to share your thoughts, but we are almost out of time, so make them brief. Welcome.
Thank you, James. Understood. I'll keep it brief. One trick I've seen that's really related to this is instead of this, we're identifying issues, like really framing it as opportunities. And we're an opportunity generator and always use that word up. And one issue I've seen is a lot of incident management happens just at the team level. Teams are seeing this happen 4 times, another team seeing this happen. So how you can create a layer above teams of sense making to organize around the opportunities, and this is our top one and we can all do this together, versus it seeming like a stream of all teams reporting problems, and that starts to feel chaotic. So something at that level to bring those opportunities together and pick the ones to action on and see results as a group.
Great. Those are some good ideas. Our time has just flown by today. We are out of time. Thank you all for your participation. I always love when we have these sort of group conversations. They always turn out great. Next week is our final book club session. We have come to the end of the book, and Mary and Tom Popendick will be joining us to discuss optimizing outcomes, which is, of course, about the short part 4 of the book, all about optimizing zone of fluency. Mary and Tom Popendick have been a huge influence on my work, and I'm very happy to have them join us for our final book club session. It's sure to be a great conversation. So mark your calendars for August 26th at 8 a.m. Pacific. The free reading, which is the entirety of part 4, which is, again, fairly short, it's up at jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 book club. You can join the Discord conversation by visiting jamesshore.com/s/AOAD2 Discord. That's it for today. Thank you very much, everybody. I will see you on the 26th. Thanks again, and see you next time.